It's time for the Ghoulie Girls.
It was first built as a hunting lodge for King Louis XIII. It would grow to become one of the most extravagant courts in Europe. The Palace of Versailles is regarded as a great achievement in 17th century art, but during the French Revolution it became a symbol of the monarchy's disregard for its people. It's believed that the souls of its former kings and queens have remained there. Common supernatural occurrences of Versailles are disembodied voices, orbs, and sudden drops in temperature, but the most reported spirit of Versailles is said to be none other than Marie Antoinette. Born Maria Antonia, Archduchess of Austria, she was the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. The date of her birth, November 2nd, is a Catholic celebration day of mourning known as the Day of the Dead. Because of the macabre implications of the date of her birthday, it was instead celebrated on November 1st, which is the more quaint All Saints' Day. Her mother, the Empress, was known to be a cunning ruler. In an effort to build a French-Austrian alliance against Prussia and Great Britain, she made peace with the longtime enemy King Louis XV by betrothing her daughter Maria Antonia to the eldest grandson and future king Louis Auguste. When she was 15 years old, Maria Antonia left her life and family behind. She adopted the French version of her name, Marie Antoinette. She and the Dauphin had already been married by proxy by the time she arrived in France. Their ceremonial wedding took place in the Palace of Versailles on May 16, 1770. Although the wedding was a cause for celebration, there were those who were still opposed to the French-Austrian alliance and did not trust the foreign princess as their future queen. Life at Versailles was a major culture shock for Marie Antoinette. She was not accustomed to the public and extravagant way of living that was now expected of her. Just after a few years of being married, Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette ascended the throne upon the death of King Louis XV. He was 19 and she was 18. The now King Louis XVI gifted his queen a chateau amongst the grounds of Versailles called the Petit Trianon. Marie Antoinette spent much of her time at the Petit Trianon because it was a way for her to escape the scrutiny of palace life. She was permitted to renovate the chateau to her heart's desire. She commissioned stunning landscape gardens and had rustic-style cottages built around her chateau. She and her friends would often dress in plain muslin dresses and play as simple peasants in the picturesque farm life setting. These childlike activities were perceived as being insensitive to the crisis that real-life farmers were having to face. In addition to her extravagant renovations of her private chateau, Marie Antoinette had also acquired a taste for the finer things and would spend lavishly on the latest fashions and lose money so easily on gambling. Many felt that her frivolous spendings were wasting the crown's money when it could have been used to aid the country that was facing a serious financial crisis. At this point, it became the norm to blame Marie Antoinette for all of France's problems. Furthermore, the king and queen had yet to produce an heir. It was apparent to all that they had yet to consummate their 7-year marriage. Marie Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, was sent by their mother to ask what was up with that. The intervention would prove to be very educational for the naive king and queen, and just a few months later, Marie Antoinette was beginning to show signs of being pregnant. And on December 19, 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth to their first child, which, to the dismay of many, turned out to be a girl. She was named Marie-Therese Charlotte. 3 years later, she gave birth to a son, Louis-Joseph Xavier Francois, the Dauphin of France. Their second son, Louis Charles, was born 4 years later. She gave birth to a second daughter named Marie-Sophie Helene Beatrix, but sadly, the poor thing only lived 11 months. Being a nurturing mother did help Marie Antoinette's public image for a short period of time. However, with France's financial situation continuing to decline as a result of many contributing factors, the king summoned a council meeting of the Assembly notables in an attempt to initiate any necessary financial reforms. The meeting was unsuccessful in its purpose, and a second meeting was scheduled to take place a few months later. But the king and queen faced a tragedy of their own when their eldest son, Louis-Joseph, died of tuberculosis of the spine. He was just 7 years old. The tragedy sent the king and queen into a great mourning, but the death of the Dauphin went unnoticed by the people of France, who were more concerned with the next meeting of the Assembly. On June 20th, 1789, the Assembly arrived at Versailles for their next meeting. But when they found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, the meeting commenced at a nearby tennis court where they took the tennis court oath to not disband until a written constitution was established. The act of defiance would lead to a number of riots throughout Paris, including the storming of the Bastille on July 14th. On October 5th, a mob of angry women of the market marched to Versailles to demand bread. By the time they reached the palace, the mob had multiplied in its numbers and killed many of the guards in their rampage. With the help of the National Guard, the royal family were forced to move to Torres Palace, where they would live under house arrest for 2 years. After an unsuccessful attempt to escape to Austria, the royal family were escorted back to Torres Palace. Now viewed as traitors, the royal family were kept under close watch. Due to the disgrace of being imprisoned again, Marie Antoinette's hair turned a shocking white overnight, the 37-year-old queen at the appearance of a fragile 70-year-old woman. On August 10, 1792, a mob attacked the Torres Palace to overthrow the monarchy. The royal family were then imprisoned in the Temple prison, where they would await their trials. King Louis was convicted of high treason and conspiracy with foreign power. He was executed by guillotine on January 21, 1793. After King Louis's execution, Marie Antoinette's fate was still up in the air. While awaiting her trial, she was separated from her 2 remaining children. Her son Louis Charles ultimately died from tuberculosis at the age of 10. Luckily, her daughter Marie Therese was safely sent to Austria. On October 16th, Marie Antoinette was found guilty for the depletion of the national treasury, conspiracy against the internal and external security of the state, and for high treason. When asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "I was a queen, and you took away my crown. A wife, you killed my husband. A mother, and you deprived me of my children. My blood alone remains. Take it, but do not make me suffer long." To prepare for her execution, Marie Antoinette was forced to wear a plain white dress. Her hair was cut off and her hands were bound tightly behind her back. She was driven in an open cart through the jeering crowds of Paris. Marie Antoinette did not wish to prolong her fate. When she arrived for her execution, she compliantly walked straight to the guillotine. The execution of Marie Antoinette was a symbol that the revolution had done its work. The Palace of Versailles was nearly abandoned upon the downfall of the monarchy. The history of its opulence has been forever linked with Marie Antoinette's reign as queen. It's said that her spirit can be seen wandering around the grounds of Versailles, but the place she is most known to haunt is the place she held most dear to her heart, the Petit Trianon. The most well-known sighting of Marie Antoinette happened on August 10, 1901, when 2 women by the names Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain stumbled upon some supernatural events during a tour to Versailles. Moberly and Jourdain were very accomplished women, especially for their time. Eleanor Jourdain became the first principal for an all-girls Hall of Resistance, St. Hugh's College in Oxford. When Charlotte Moberly was appointed to be her assistant, the 2 women really hit it off. As a way to get acquainted with each other, the women agreed to take a tour to Versailles. While on their tour inside the palace, Moberly and Jourdain felt a bit underwhelmed. Neither of them had much knowledge of its history and didn't fully appreciate what they were seeing. However, Jourdain suggested that they go see the famous Petit Trianon before leaving. As they headed in the direction of the chateau, the women found themselves lost and in need of directions when they came across 2 men that seemed very dignified yet out of place. The men were dressed in long grayish coats and wore small 3-cornered hats. The 2 gentlemen told them to keep going straight on, but as Moberly and Jourdain ventured on, an overwhelming sense of depression overcame both of them. The atmosphere changed and all of the trees around them seemed to suddenly look flat and lifeless. As they reached the end of the path, they became alarmed when they spotted a frightening-looking man standing by a garden gazebo. The man was wearing a black cape, and his complexion is described as looking dark and rough and looked as though it was marked with smallpox. As the man looked in their direction, his expression seemed blank yet sinister. Both women felt uneasy by his presence and went past him as fast as they could when they were suddenly approached by a tall, young man. This man had black curly hair and was wearing a large sombrero-style hat. Although this man seemed anxious, they found him to be more trustworthy. With his help, Moberly and Jourdain were finally able to locate the Petit Trianon after crossing a small bridge over the brooks. The chateau was surrounded by big, beautiful trees, and Jourdain right away noticed a lovely woman sitting in the middle of the lush garden sketching. At first, it seemed that the woman was just another tourist. However, with her old-fashioned white summer dress and large shady hat, the lady was far too regal to be another tourist. Although both Moberly and Jourdain found their experience of the tour to be pretty strange, they didn't discuss it until a week later, when Jourdain asked Moberly if she thinks the Petit Trianon was haunted, to which Moberly simply replied, yes. This icebreaker prompted them to recount what each had experienced that day. Both distinctly remembered feeling a sense of dread and how terrified they were by the man at the gazebo. Jourdain said that if they had known that the lovely lady was just around the corner, then perhaps they wouldn't have been so scared. But Moberly didn't know who she was talking about and did not remember seeing such a woman. But she did admit feeling as if someone were around that she couldn't see. As they discussed it further, they would come to realize that each had witnessed objects or people that the other did not. To make sense of it all, they decided to separately write what they each experienced from their own perspectives. They also began doing diligent research of the Trion's history. As part of their research, they took a few more trips to the palace grounds to retrace their steps. However, on these trips, they weren't ever able to take the same paths as they did before. Certain landmarks such as the gazebo and the little bridge were nowhere to be seen, which made the women confused. When they inquired about the men in the grayish-green coats, they learned that the green was the color worn by royal servants from years past. Moberly and Jourdain did consider that maybe they just happened to stumble upon some sort of play or reenactment, but when they were told that no such events occurred that day, they started to consider other explanations, like maybe a time slip or time travel. As they continued their research, Moberly came across a portrait of Marie Antoinette. She immediately recognized her to be the woman at the Trion's garden. The resemblance was uncanny. This meant that they could now pinpoint the time frame of their research. This led them to identify the man at the gazebo as being Count de Vaudreuil, who was part of Marie Antoinette's inner circle and was a frequent guest at the Tryon. Upon their research, they found that he was born in the West Indies, which could explain his dark complexion. And while preparing for a history lesson of the French Revolution, Jourdain noticed that the date of August 10th held some important significance. August 10th, 1792 happened to be the date that the Tuileries Palace was demolished during the time that the royal family was held prisoner there. This piece of information led Moberly to put out a new theory that perhaps they entered into a memory of Marie Antoinette. Her reasoning for this theory is based on the fact that Marie Antoinette was no longer at Versailles on that date. She figured that while Marie Antoinette faced the final destruction of the monarchy, she left with just the memory of her safe haven before being taken away. Additionally, when Moberly was visited by a French friend, the friend, without knowing about her experience, brought up the subject of Versailles being haunted. The friend said that she knew some people who have claimed to see the ghost of Marie Antoinette and that she was known to be seen on a particular date every year. With their gathered information, Moberly and Jourdain were convinced that what they experienced at the Tryon was supernatural. They published their story after 10 years of research in a book called An Adventure. Both women used pen names for their publication. Moberly went by Elizabeth Morrison and Jourdain went by Frances Lamont. An Adventure was a success upon its release. Readers were fascinated by the idea of Marie Antoinette's ghost haunting the grounds of Versailles. However, the book did have some harsh criticism, with many critics viewing it as just a fictional story. Others would find their claims to be inconsistent and far-fetched. And even the Society for Psychical Research went on to debunk their claims. But despite all this, both Moberly and Jourdain always stood by their story and were happy to retell it to anyone who wanted to hear it. In 1924, Jourdain sadly passed away from a heart attack that she suffered when she was forced to resign as headmistress. Moberly passed away in 1937 at the age of 90. Moberly and Jourdain's identities were made public in 1931. The events of their adventure at Versailles has gone on to be known as the Moberly and Jourdain Incident. Now it's time for the girls to have a ghoulie discussion.
Let's talk about scary things.
So there are a lot of other theories that people have that are not of the supernatural kind that we could discuss later, but first I would like us to discuss our opinions and if we believe the Petite Trianon is really haunted by Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, I believe it, and I'm somebody who's very obsessed with time travel and time warps and time loops. This is one I believed for a while.
I believe it's haunted. From what I hear of the story, I believe it's like a pattern in time that is repeating itself. That energy is stuck there. Yeah, I believe it's a memory of Marie Antoinette, but it's also like that pattern of time that is being replayed. It just seems like she's living life as if she's in that time.
Yeah.
That everything's that's going on is like kind of like you're walking into that time.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was thinking. People think that the memory theory is a bit like outlandish, but also keep in mind that they aren't psychical researchers and don't know the correct terms to use when it comes to this. Yeah, memory and time patterns basically pertain to the same thing because it's energy.
Pretty much anything is possible with that land being so old and so many historical things happening there. Mm-hmm. There's so much energy that's there and so much that happened over the years, even previous to, Marie Antoinette's time. But all the tragedy that happened there has to be some type of activity, and especially historical places. I feel like historical places always have that kind of energy, and it's not surprising to hear a story like this connected to Versailles. I think really cool.
I was really intrigued by the story. It really reminded me of the movie Midnight in Paris, where he steps onto a carriage and it takes anybody to their desired time destination.
Yeah.
I remember at one point in the movie, a detective that's following Owen Wilson's character goes back to Versailles when it's King Louis XV. It makes you wonder also if this story had any influence on that movie. It's kind of uncanny, the similarities.
Yeah, I felt the same way the first time I heard the story. It automatically made me think of that movie as well. You don't hear very many stories like this.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a rare thing that you hear, but
yeah.
I think the significant thing about this story, which I think is like, they were experiencing some different things though.
Yeah.
They experienced a lot of the same things, but there's a few things that like one experienced that the other didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't even share their experience until later on, and then decided to each write it down and compare. They didn't sit there and talk about it and say, oh yeah, I experienced that. They sat separately and wrote what they experienced and then compared it. And then that's when they saw like, oh, well, I didn't experience that. I mean, that to me is kind of like, okay.
Yeah, because some of the backlash with their story is people say that maybe they fed into each other too much and influenced each other's, how they remember it. They do kind of stick with their own story. Like, no, I didn't see Marie Antoinette, but I do remember feeling an energy around. Yeah, I think that's kind of an unfair claim that people have of them just feeding into each other.
If they had fed into each other, they would have been like, oh yeah, maybe I did see that, or yeah, you're right, But the fact that you said they're sticking to their own version of the story, I mean, I think that proves that they were experiencing the same thing, but also there's a little differences. I don't know what the differences mean, but to me, it gives it more credibility.
It's also interesting the way that some of the spirits or whatever that they encountered, some of them they were able to interact with, and some of them they didn't.
Yes.
Like the first two men in the grayish-green coats, they were able to converse with them and they were able to give them directions. The guy at the gazebo didn't seem to really be aware of their presence. They described him as being kind of blank and no emotions.
Yeah.
But then the guy who they saw right after him, he was able to interact with them and direct them. And Marie Antoinette,
very oblivious to everything else that was going on. She was just in her own experience. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's all very interesting.
And objects too. I mean, the bridge that went over the brooks and the gazebo.
That's interesting.
They were all able to trace everything back.
I do want to go there someday. It's very historical, and I mean, come on. We're talking about ghost stories for a reason. I think it's interesting.
What do you guys think about like how they weren't really all that impressed with Versailles, like beginning of their tour? That part I find hard to believe. Like, how could you not find this interesting? Especially them being like academics and historians themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's funny because, well, like for me, Versailles would be like one of my top 5 because I wanted to major in history because I'm just attracted to historical things. So for me, that's the draw to Versailles. So like you said, it seems like they would be so intrigued because of the historical significance in their background, but maybe they weren't intrigued because something was pulling them, the energy was, they were distracted because the energy was pulling them elsewhere.
Yeah.
They got pulled away from Versailles. So maybe it was not a conscious thing, the significance of them not really being intrigued or impressed.
Yeah. I was looking at some people recording their tours at Versailles, and it looks like there's a lot of portraits and such of Marie Antoinette. I wonder if they saw any portraits of Marie Antoinette before going to the Petit Trianon, because there is a particular portrait of her where Jourdain was able to identify her as a woman in the garden. And I've seen that portrait is hanging in Versailles. Mm-hmm. So just like, did they not come across that portrait when they were touring the inside of the palace?
Yeah, or maybe they were just very distracted, and I didn't think about that before, but yeah, that's pretty strange.
Yeah, it seems like seeing her in the garden right after seeing portraits of her in the palace, you would make the connection. Yeah. And then in there, hey, that looks like Marie Antoinette.
Yeah, I mean, everyone has an image of Marie Antoinette. I mean, I think even back in that time, she's a recognizable figure, even at that time. I mean, that had to be why they went to Versailles.
Yeah.
You know, they had to have seen pictures of her before they even went to Versailles.
Yeah, that's what
I find that
I
hard
think
to
too.
believe.
That's one of the parts of the story I felt was a hole,
Yeah.
you know, in their story because, you know, I do believe it, but, you know, some parts I think they exaggerated.
There are certain things that just don't make sense.
Yeah, I think they just, you know, add on to the story just to add spice to it. I think a lot of people do.
And a lot of people do feel that way. Like that, you know, they did 10 years of research and they decided they pinpoint on a certain day and year and kind of based their story around that. So do you guys want to hear some of the theories that people have presented to debunk their stories?
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1965, a biography of some French poet that resided nearby Versailles was known to throw like really lavish, extravagant parties where he and his friends dressed in period costume. Him and his friends were often dressed in drag. So the lady that Jourdain saw and identified as Marie Antoinette could have easily been a man dressed in drag while attending that party.
And I remember hearing that too, and I just felt like it just seemed their experience was spread out amongst the grounds. It wasn't just in a particular area.
Yeah.
So, like, if he does these stage plays, I'm sure it would have been in just a particular area because that's when people are going to experience a stage play. Their experience was over, you know, a certain amount of, you know, because it's quite a few miles away from, you know, the actual palace.
Yeah.
And they experienced all these things along the way. I just feel like his, you know, it would have had to be a pretty elaborate stage setup for them to even believe that, which I don't even think was possible at the time. It's not like it was a movie set or something that would be like that believable, you know, like we would have nowadays. Just, to me, just doesn't seem very, you know, if they bumped into one person and bumped, you know, but the whole experience, there's no way that, in my opinion. And
they did consider it at one point, like maybe that they just came across like some reenactment or something, and they did inquire to find out if an event like that was occurring that day when they visited Versailles, and they were told that no.
I mean, it could have happened. Could have been that type of party. Nothing wrong with that. I just think they always try to come up with really extravagant stories to discredit the story. I believe a supernatural occurrence.
And a student of theirs had later on published a book claiming that they were lesbian lovers and that the experience, that they had a shared delusion based on their lesbian relationship.
Yeah, I do remember hearing about that.
So, well, first of all, it seems very homophobic. Like, you can't trust them. They're lesbians.
Overreaching.
Yeah, and that's another thing. It's just like, they're claiming that their story is so outlandish, but then they put out some outlandish theories by saying, oh, well, it's a shared delusion because they're lesbians.
And actually wrote a book about it.
Yep, and actually wrote a book about it. Yeah, it's apparently called A Folle et Deux. And apparently, like, there's always, like, the stronger personality that influences the other person that kind of, like, you know, feed into each other. And so, yeah, that's the other theory. There were other things that would kind of also ruin their reputation and take away their credibility. In 1914, Morbely claimed to have seen the apparition of Roman Emperor Constantine, and nobody who was around had witnessed what she had apparently witnessed. So people think that she has a tendency to run into historic people wherever she goes.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound
pretty out there.
I mean, you can, you know, find one experience really intriguing, but when you're having multiple ones, that's when it's like, okay.
Yeah. During the First World War, Jourdain kind of like became paranoid and was convinced that there was a German spy hiding in the college. So her erratic behavior is what led her to have to step down as headmistress.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't know about those other occurrences, so that would definitely make me question their credibility.
Yeah.
Even though I do want to believe that they had this experience, because I think it's an amazing story and it's something I would love to experience myself, and I do believe it's possible. Stepping into time and experiencing historical events, and they have a lot to lose to share these experiences, but
And also, it's interesting because people like to say that it's them publishing their stories as a way for them to get attention, but they used pen names. So if they're using different names, then why would they be doing it to get attention?
Yeah, and they did research for 10 years before they came out with the book, and they were really hesitant.
Yeah.
And like you said, they used pen names, so it's not like they were trying to get their names out there or become famous. They wanted to share their story.
Yeah.
It just seems like a place that really is haunted. I've always been intrigued by it. Definitely one of the top ones I want to go to visit as far as haunted places. I just hope I get the opportunity someday.
I'm sure there's tons of stories of things happening and going on energetically in a place like Versailles. I'm just intrigued by Marie Antoinette and Versailles in general, mostly because it's a very tragic story. She, got married young, died in such a tragic way. I think people think of her as let them eat cake.
Yeah.
But there was so much more to her than people realize. And,
She became the scapegoat. I think she was a very misunderstood person, and she became the subject of a lot of ridicule because, there was just so much anger and frustration with what was going on in the economy, and put the blame on somebody, and it was Marie Antoinette, because people never trusted her because she was a foreign princess, and people pretty much already made up their minds about her.
I feel like a lot of people set her up in a lot of ways, like how they wanted her to live like this extravagant life and lifestyle, and how she kind of was uncomfortable with that at first, and then she got used to it, where literally that's why she was executed. I think it was just her being the product of what they created.
Oh, and she was a child.
Yeah,
she
she
was
was a
young.
kid.
They were both so young when they became king and queen. They were not prepared. And she didn't make the financial decision. There were people around them making those decisions because they were so young. They didn't really know what they were doing, and there were other things that were going on. Yeah, they did have an extravagant lifestyle, but they did blame her for a lot that she didn't have any responsibility for or knowledge of, because it took them so long to consummate their marriage. Of course, she was to blame for that, and then the years that it took for them to finally have a baby, and she was the blame for that. It was like everything that was going on she was always the blame. It's a tragic story, honestly. It is.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the whole story, and I believe there's a whole lot more history there, a whole lot more energy there, and activity than people than is out there. And I think it'd be really interesting to go just to see what you experience as it being such a historic place and so much tragedy occurring there as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you don't want to miss out on any of our latest Ghoulie Tales.